Now in this video, what I want to do is describe a situation in which Congress attempted to push back against the expansion of presidential power, and they were successful in doing so. And it's probably going to sound a little bit boring because we're going to be talking about budgets and impounding money and things like that. But I think it's important to know that Congress can push back when they have the will to do so. And quite frankly, as I've sort of intimated before, I wish they would do it more often. So this has to do with the passage of what's called the Budget and Impoundment Act. And so in order to explain what this law did, I want to go back and talk about the way the normal process works in terms of spending money at the national level. So Congress will pass a law, or again, technically, Congress will pass a bill that the president signs into law that involves spending money. And so this can be infrastructure spending. It could be money that's being spent on national defense. It can be money spent fighting the pandemic. It can be a variety of things, right? And then once the bill becomes a law, then that means that the president's job is to carry out the law and spend the money in the way that was authorized by Congress. So whatever Congress said the president was supposed to spend the money on, that's what the president is supposed to spend the money on. And usually Congress gives presidents a little bit of latitude on how they spend the money, but they do provide clear indications on how the money is to be spent. Under President Nixon, this is what he was doing. Congress would pass a law that he would sign into law that involves spending money. And the president would just impound the money. And by impound, I mean just refuse to spend the money. Now, he signed it into law, and in the law it says this is how money needs to be spent. If President Nixon decided that the money was a waste, that it wasn't useful, or if he disagreed with the policy, he would just impound the money. Just say, I'm not going to spend it. And that's outside of his authority. Now, presidents can impound money sometimes. So for example, if Congress passes a law and that involves spending money, and by the time it becomes a law, the thing that they were supposed to try and fix with the money has been taken care of, then it's a good idea to have the president be able to impound that money and not spend it, right? So it's okay sometimes, but presidents aren't supposed to impound money because they disagree with a policy passed by Congress. That's not their job. Like I said, according to the framers, Congress debates the issues of the day. They come up with the compromises that are going to pass both the House and the Senate. They agree on an amount and what that's going to be spent on. If the president signs it into law, the president's job is to see that the laws are faithfully executed. And President Nixon wasn't doing that. President Nixon had this idea that anything he did as president was legal because he was president. And that's not the way our system works. Presidents are not above the law. So this is what the Budget Impoundment Act did. The Budget Impoundment Act required the president to notify Congress in case of an impoundment. So in other words, they didn't say, okay, presidents can't impound money. They recognized that there might be instances in which it would be a good idea for a president to impound money, right? But there was no way that they were going to accept the idea that a president can impound money and not even tell Congress about it. And so what the Budget Impoundment Act did is it required the president to notify Congress in case of an impoundment. Once Congress was notified, then what Congress could do if they wanted to, if they thought that the impoundment was a legitimate impoundment, if they thought, oh yeah, that's a good idea that the president spend that money, Congress could then go ahead and vote not to spend the money. In other words, the president could would say, I'm impounding the money and here's why, because he would have to notify Congress. Congress would get the message from the president and say, oh, wow, that's good. Good thinking. Then Congress would have to vote to not spend the money because they'd already voted to spend the money. And since they're the ones in charge of spending money, they're the only ones who could say, don't spend the money. But the other part of the Budget Impoundment Act says that if the president impounds money and sends a message to Congress saying, I've impounded the money, and Congress does nothing, they don't respond, they don't do anything, within 60 days, the president is required by law to spend that money. In other words, Congress wrote the law in such a way that they didn't have to vote again to spend the money. They'd already done that. If they did nothing, they get the message that the president has impounded money, and they just don't respond. Within 60 days, the president is required by law to spend that money. Since the passage of the Budget Impoundment Act, presidents have stopped impounding money the way Richard Nixon was doing. So now why were they successful with the Budget Impoundment Act, but not successful when it came to the War Powers Act? Because the Constitution is unambiguous about which branch of government controls the money. They call it the power of the purse. It's clear that the framers intended Congress to have that power. When it comes to the power as commander-in-chief, that's a more ambiguous area. And so presidents could defy Congress in their capacity as commander-in-chief, and they had a little bit more room to maneuver, but not when it came to spending money. And so since the passage of the Budget and Impoundment Act, presidents have no longer impounded money without notifying Congress. They now, when Congress passes a law that requires them to spend money, they do that. Now, presidents do other things, by the way, to get around sometimes the way Congress spends money. Sometimes they'll do what's called reprogramming, where they'll take money from one program and spend it on something else. So there's still a negotiation that goes on between presidents and Congress, but the Budget Impoundment Act is an example of Congress pushing back on the growth of presidential power and being successful in doing so. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then we're going to get on to the next subject where we're going to explore presidential power a little more broadly. And that will be in the next video.